Welcome to Half Past Capitalism, where we talk about alternatives to capitalism as if they were possible. This show is part of the Harbinger Media Network, and our guest today is Evan Henshaw-Plath. I first met Evan through work on Indie Media, the sort of global anarchist media network, just about 20 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
The time has flown. Since then, he's been involved in a dizzying range of startups and activist projects. Notably, he was an employee #1, I believe, at Twitter, and he worked for a whole bunch of different companies, including Fortune 500 companies, but he also co-founded a worker cooperative in Uruguay. And he helped build, as I said, Indie Media, and created organizing tools for activist groups, which we could maybe talk about. His recent project is Planetary, a bold attempt to build a new basis for social media that removes centralized corporate control from the equation. So creating a new sort of decentralized platform for social media type activity. And we're going to talk about as many of these things as we can, because there's a whole bunch. So welcome, Evan. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's lots of fun to talk about all this stuff.
Cool. So I guess before we get into your projects, one thing you've discussed, I've seen in sort of, different talks and certainly in our conversations over the years, that activist projects, one of them being sort of like Text Mob, became the inspiration for things like Twitter. But there are a few other examples, I think, as well. But I just wanted to start by asking, like, what, obviously there are reasons to be cautious in terms of, I sort of see, you have a lot of experience in Silicon Valley, and I see that as sort of like one of the main engines of global capitalism or 21st century capitalism. Software eats the world and all that. But I was wondering, kind of coming from that world, if there's anything that you see that sort of the activist world or the anti-capitalist world could or should learn from the Valley.
That's a great question. So, the number of things that are activist projects that get translated into big tech businesses just goes on and on. And right now there's this world of Google Play and the Apple App Store, but that entire model comes from Debian, which is a non-capitalist or anti-capitalist Linux distribution that's run cooperatively, and they created the idea of an app store, and then Apple just copied it and added payments, and then it became a $1 trillion industry. One of the things, though, we face when trying to go the other direction is saying, how do we use this kind of tech for activists, is we either use too much of the surveillance or not enough of the surveillance. So we say that we believe in privacy and we believe in protecting user things, and so therefore we're not going to track anything, and we're not going to understand things, and we're not going to run standard kind of marketing A/B tests. And the best example of this is Signal. Signal is now a widely used, secure, activist tech platform. It's not run by a for-profit corporation. It's open source. It's not federated, but it is distinctly not, it's like the big tech platform that consumers use that's not capitalist. And Signal has a hard time competing against WhatsApp and WeChat and Telegram because Signal knows nothing about its users. Like, Signal employs none of the, should the stickers thing go on the left side and should it go on the right side, or what's the right reaction to it, or here's a survey to the users about, whether or not these features are a good idea. And sometimes that makes really nicely opinionated software, but it also makes software that just doesn't quite have the polish that we expect of sort of high budget consumer software. And so I think there's a middle ground, like letting users say, okay, I trust Signal, I'm going to opt in to algorithmic manipulation of my feed in a way that we're doing cooperatively. And I'm going to opt in to tracking my usage and location because I want Signal to get better. And at least Signal is going to do a better job of protecting that data and using it for its intended purpose, rather than like, oh, we, like Facebook, we need your phone number to recover this account. And then we're going to cross-reference that to do all these ad targeting. And so there's a lot of power in machine learning, a lot of power in the algorithms, a lot of power in the sort of data-driven software design that the activist world kind of goes, this is horrible, and rejects. And I think as long as we do that, we are never going to build software that feels as good.
Right, and I mean, that I feel like that's sort of one of the things that I've sort of learned from you, or sort of realized talking to you, is that UX is really destiny, in the sense that you give something that extra bit of polish. Apple spends those extra like 3 person years like making the iPhone like have the right acceleration curve that's just perfectly pleasing, and then they make they become $1 trillion business pretty much on the strength of that, as far as I can tell, of obviously product design, but really it's a lot of the user experience.
Sure.
And I feel like that's one of the pitfalls of what's that?
It's so hard and so subtle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the pitfalls of sort of open source projects, but also maybe anti-capitalist projects as well, just maybe even outside the software world, is that we end up sort of saying like, we're prioritizing these values, but as a result, we're not focusing on making the experience as sort of frictionless as possible. I guess I wanted to bridge that into Planetary, which is your sort of social media project, which you're working on now. I guess just to start, like, overall, how's it going? But also, like, how are you balancing those things in Planetary specifically that you were talking about?
I mean, how's it going? So the app exists. We built the app. It's based on this protocol called Secure Scuttlebutt, which is an open source protocol that has an online community of people who they call themselves solar punks. They like to live off the grid and have a positive sort of hacker view of the world. And so people are using it, and we achieved much more polish in the app than the existing decentralized apps. The existing decentralized apps are about as easy to use as a Bitcoin wallet, where you're doing it all yourself. And so the problem is we were dancing the line between, like, we looked at where we could get money for this. And we got our initial money from venture capital. And the venture capitalists were fine with us taking risks. They were fine with us using open source licenses. They were, what the problem we ran into is we launched it and we're getting some use, and we couldn't get follow-on funding precisely because we didn't have the growth numbers that they would need to see. You kind of need to see it take off. And we didn't have the growth numbers because we didn't have the time to focus on that kind of quality. So it's sort of this catch-22. And so at the moment, Planetary is a very beautiful, a bit clunky, decentralized social media app. And what I've been trying to do is say, okay, well, what can we learn from this? And how do we balance these existing platforms with a user base? So, like, one of the things that happens, especially in social software, is once you get a community of people using it and that's where you go and that's where it's happening, the social cost of changing is so high, it doesn't matter how you do it. Like, eBay still exists. People still use PayPal. Craigslist exists. All these things have tremendous momentum. And when you're trying to build something new that has a new set of social relations and a new set of connections, it's very hard to get enough people to join the community at the same time that you start getting its own sort of self-creating cycles. And so Planetary is in this situation where we have, in the protocol, there are tens of thousands of people actively using it. Some of them using Planetary, some of them using other applications like Patchwork and Miniverse, but it's not enough for the majority of people when you show up, because you get sort of the, it's like walking around a city after a deadly virus killed everyone. It's like, you can see that it's beautiful. You can see that people used to do, like, oh, there used to be a shop here. Oh, there used to be, this is the plaza where people used to camp, but there's like no one there. And that's super tricky. And I actually don't know the solution to that. And I don't think that the capitalist solution to it is what TikTok did, which is you make the viral loop of engagement work on a small level, and then you just spend $1 billion getting users.
Yeah, that's one solution. I mean, one thing that sort of strikes me is that the numbers that, I mean, maybe $1 billion is starting to get into big numbers, but at the level of like activist financing, building a decentralized social media network is maybe a lot, but at the level of like, I don't know, a government, like we're talking about like a small project in a municipal budget, in terms of like the amount of dev time that it would take to like take it to the next level, as far as I can tell. And I'm just wondering if there's sort of a public sector route that you've ever considered, or if that's if
so I have the disfortune of living in the United States, and there is public sector funding, and I'm a consultant with a group called socialroots.io that are attempting to get US government funding, but it's a very slow and complicated process, and there's no ideological alignment from government funding here. Now in Europe, there's something called the NGI, which is the Next Generation Internet Fund. And NGI has funded, I don't know, 500 projects developing this kind of technology. Now, the problem is that they're focused on the underlying technology and not the user experience, it's great. They're focusing on open technology, open licenses, open networks, privacy aware, all this kind of encryption forward, all that stuff. It's great. But they're doing all the underlying work, and there's no clear way to translate the underlying work, which governments fund, like basic science, and the sort of visual thing. And we see some funding in crowdfunding, but you're right, it's actually not that much money. I spent all of last year, I was in Portland and involved with the Black Lives Matter protests. And we, as the protest movement, raised somewhere between $2 and $3 million to fund the movement. And that money was raised through social media sharing donation links. And it wasn't through a single organization, but it was through sort of a network of organizations. And we bought vans and ambulances and paid for housing, and even paid for stipends for activists who couldn't show up and organize otherwise. And so it was super effective, but it was something that we haven't quite figured out how to crowdfund software in the same way.
Yeah, that makes sense. And is there sort of a, I mean, does capitalist policy sort of come into the play here? Because I mean, I feel like, the analogy in like pharmaceuticals or something, it would be like, okay, well, yeah, you can do the basic research to understand how mRNA works or something like that. But then when it's time to like take it to the end user, basically, then it's like, oh no, big pharma has to come in and patent everything and package it, and because that's where the money's made. Is there an analogy in software in terms of public funding?
Absolutely. That's exactly how the public funding of software works. Venture capital does not fund new software development. I mean, they don't fund research and development. They fund commercialization of the tools that you have or that exist. Now, there are consortiums of big companies that fund basic research that pushes things forward. So the most well-known is the Open AI initiative. And that is $1 billion that came from Microsoft and Google and a bunch of the other big tech companies. And they put it into a common pool, and they paid hundreds of researchers to do basic research and then provide it back out as commercialized. Initially, it was supposed to be open license, and then Microsoft basically took over, bought the nonprofit by putting in another $500 million. And so now all that research is only directly usable on Microsoft services. But so like big tech companies are funding basic research, but venture capital, the investment side, does not. And the reason they don't is because venture capital is about validating and then scaling businesses. It's, yes, you can use it to develop new things. Yes, you can develop new products, but the money isn't there to say, I think this is where we should go build it. You kind of got to have the parts mostly put together. And that's why we see this proliferation of apps and of websites and things like that do different things, because the cloud providers, Microsoft Azure and AWS and Amazon and Google Cloud and a few others, they provide you like all of these components. And so rather than creating a mold to make your own Lego pieces with plastic, you're just buying lots of Legos and like building neat things. And we don't have, and that's a really risky, like oddly enough, that's a really risky process, building something new with the Legos that they give you, like all the little components. And the funding systems that we have in the cooperative space are good at taking functional businesses and business models from one market and moving it to another market, or taking a really well understood business and saying, instead of having it, instead of farmers selling to a distributor, they're going to create a producers co-op and do the same thing. So you already have you have sort of both sides of the market exist, and all you need to do is change the structure of the business. And so Mondragon has like a 97% success rate on new enterprises, because they only try things that are proven businesses. Whereas the tech sector is constantly trying to take its set of technology Legos and go in and replace, it's almost like every part of the economy is like a solar punk bespoke, it's got its own custom made tubes and wiring, everything else. And that's bureaucracy. And that's the way the businesses work. And what tech is doing is taking its set of Legos and saying, oh, I can make these Legos look like an airline. I can make these Legos look like a hotel. I can make these Legos look like a taxi service. I can make these Legos look like a graphic design studio. And every time they do that, they take a big part of the economy and that was hard to build and well established, and they destroy it and they replace it with something that's more efficient, where they control the value flow. And but the cooperative sector, the social impact sector, the activists, like none of those sectors are set up to try lots of things and take lots of risks and fail bunches of times to see what works.
Right. And is that just a limitation of like the volume of capital, or is there a potential way for the cooperative sector to start to, I don't know, be able to do more of this innovation, sort of throw stuff at the wall, see what works kind of stuff?
So in some ways, it's the lack of capital, but there's a lot of capital there. Like if we realize that the cooperative sector can include taking control of governments and then using that economic development funds for co-ops instead of local businesses. Like there's a ton of economic development funds in governments all over the world, from local governments to national governments. And we could prioritize that for co-ops. And you saw in Argentina under the Kitcheners, where you had 30,000 co-ops formed in a few years, when they basically just created funds to inject capital into failed businesses if they converted them into co-ops. So like, we can do that. Governments are terrible at understanding the risk. In fact, venture capitalists are terrible at understanding the risk. Entrepreneurs are terrible at understanding what's going to be successful. If entrepreneurs knew what was going to be successful, Steve Jobs wouldn't have tried to sell Apple to HP. You know, Yahoo wouldn't have tried to sell Yahoo. The Yahoo founders wouldn't have tried to sell to Netscape. The Google founders wouldn't have tried to sell to Yahoo. The Twitter founders wouldn't have tried to sell to Yahoo and Google. Like, if anybody in the cycle understood which ones were going to be successful, they would either have bought the companies that were going to become successful, or they wouldn't have tried desperately to sell their companies instead of going on their own. And so the thing is, when you structure things cooperatively, we don't have a good way of understanding and returning back into a common pool that 1000x return. So venture capital is like, we don't know what's going to work. Let's just like invest in people who look like me and went to Stanford or MIT and, you know, look like they act like the right type of people. And it works. Like, those matching algorithms that investors do work, but like only 1 in 100 times. The thing is that 1 in 100 times you get a 10,000 return on your investment. And so you can fail all the time. And as long as you get that hit that becomes ByteDance or Facebook or the new Google or Airbnb or any number of thousands of the companies, like San Francisco's Silicon Valley creates $1 billion company every 3 months, and has for the last 60 years. So as long as you know that you get that hit, you're okay with it. And we structure cooperative investments to limit the upside of these things. If you limit the upside of the hit, then you don't have the return of capital to put in money into the next time, and you don't have people lending you capital. Like, we either need to be able to do high risk investment from government funds that benefit basically because the economy grows, or we need to do cooperative, like mutual aid, cooperative banks, credit union investment in a way that comes back to a common pool where they can know that they'll get the return on the investment to take the high risk. And we need to structure the deals that allow it. And no one in the platform co-op world has figured out how to structure the deals or convince the cooperative social, impact limited partners to put in that money. Capitalism, it kind of reproduces itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's really tricky because, the idea behind a cooperative is that you hand over all the power to the people who are directly involved in it. But at the same time, if you create like an idea that goes like wildly viral, then you also, and that happened because you failed 1,000 times before you got to that business model, then obviously you want to find a way to capture some of that and bring and do it so you can do the next 1,000, which is obviously what VCs do. But yeah, it seems like it's a tricky sort of balancing act in terms of cooperatives, and then and their values.
I don't know if you're familiar with Stocksy.
I am.
So Stocksy is this Canadian cooperative headquartered in Victoria, BC, that is a mix of it's a multi-stakeholder co-op, and they use the capital from the founders who had sold another photo licensing app, and they paid them back out, and then they created photographers who are shareholders, and I think there's like 980 of them, and made them cooperative owners. And those shareholders, cooperative shareholders, then voted to never add any more creators.
Is that what happened? I didn't realize. That's amazing.
I mean, so if you got in, or you are waitlisted when one person quits and stops being a worker owner of these independent photographers, then you get to go in and you get to be a participant, and you're basically in this guild it's a cooperative, but it's also a guild. And the existing photographers all benefit from not sharing ownership or growing it. And so if they only had shareholders that were concerned about shareholder value, then they wouldn't shut it down at just 1,000 co-op members. And so it's like this terrible, terrible irony.
Right, which is the kind of place, that's exactly the moment where you need somebody on the board who's from some kind of like broader co-op movement association who can be like, okay, that, that's nice, but I'm here to strongly mobilize and advocate for a path that keeps growing that and keeps benefiting more people, and returns some of that benefit, not just to these particular set of photographers who got lucky with a great business model, but to the broader movement.
And you have some, like the credit union movement in the United States is, in the cooperative bank movement in other countries, like the people running those do get the idea of expanding. Like they're not passive about trying to expand their mandate, expand their customer base and grow, but they're fairly narrow in their understanding of the benefits for it. So they definitely are tied back to a community. They invest in the community. They do better than for-profit banks in that investment, but they don't anymore see their role as cooperativizing the economy. They see themselves as a community-focused bank.
Yeah, and that seems to me to be like both the strength of the cooperative model and also its weakness, in the sense that it, as soon as the point of a co-op is to meet the need of the members, and as soon as those needs are met, it tends to just sort of stop or slow down significantly. Whereas in order for co-ops to meet the potential of addressing the like major planetary needs of, I don't know, human survival or ecological non-collapse, they're going to have to expand at a much higher rate, and so you need to infuse it with ambition somewhere, which is where I feel like some kind of meta organization, or I don't know, I mean, it's easy to get vanguardist, but what do you see as the sort of models there?
I mean, it doesn't just have to be the members. Like Mondragon, for example, their mission is Basque, the Basque culture, the Basque people, the Basque nation. So they didn't limit themselves to just the current worker owners or their families or those particular towns. So we know that cooperative movements can be based in things that aren't just worker members. You can have a larger ideological view. The truth of the matter is, when it comes to technology, a small group of people can have a tremendously outsized effect. It's the intern at Twitter founded Instagram. When there was 12 people at Twitter, one of the guys, Kevin, quit and went off, and then a couple years later founded Instagram. And the WhatsApp folks were engineers at Yahoo. Like the actual community of people who are building these platforms that grow is tremendous. Here's another example. Jack Dorsey is CEO of Twitter and Square. Moxie Marlinspike created Signal. Those two were the two people competing for the job that Jack got hired for. Just the two of them. And like one went off and founded Twitter and Square, and the other one created Signal. Like there's a way in which the network and the effect and the ability to create stuff and the ability to amplify it is held in a teeny group of people. Now, it doesn't mean that like other people can't do it, because the tools are there, but if you look at who actually creates these platforms, it's not a large group. And so in that way, to use a very Marxist sort of vanguardist perspective on things is not a bad tactic, because once you build digital technologies, or once you build sort of systems that have virtuous cycles and use digital technology to build them, they can just keep going. and they can reach ever larger audiences. And so building in the values into these platforms is super important. One of the things Eli Perzier, who created Move On and Civic Signals and a bunch of other stuff like that, talks about is how our digital social software is like a built architectural ecosystem. It's like urban design. And so, but a few people who are software developers and designers are like they've got SimCity, basically. Like, you can design it, but like, I don't need 10,000 construction workers to build it. Small teams can build these things and they can have tremendous effect. And then we get to decide, you know, do we focus these cities on cars? It's like, do we focus them on advertising? Or do we build ways in which creators can independently support themselves? Or do we build it into a blockchain system where every transaction has this sort of everything you do as a microtransaction that you pay for, that then supposed to economically reward the right people? Like, we get to decide that. We get to decide whether or not we care about gender inequality, whether or not we care about racism. A great example is Nextdoor. Nextdoor is a very wholesome, well-meaning, cooperative vision, mission-driven business around local news and connecting you with your neighbors. And Nextdoor is used for huge amounts of racism and gentrification. And, you know, Nextdoor sent me multiple emails this week of someone taking photos of someone in their car claiming that they were masturbating and smoking crack cocaine. Like, that's not news to me. That's not breaking news. That's like what they choose to make viral, what they choose to support, how they chose to design their system. And so, even though they didn't intend to make any kind of negative stuff, they designed a system that encourages all sorts of horrible antisocial behavior.
There's a bunch of things there, but the key piece seems to be that a small number of people get to make those decisions, and then you don't have, like, in order to scale up, you don't have to train tens of thousands of people in those values. You just add servers to a rack, basically, and that's obviously a lot faster. You can do that a lot faster and cheaper.
Servers. They just allocate virtual servers.
Yeah, exactly.
On someone's cloud.
Right. So obviously that
eventually someone is adding a server to a rack
somewhere down the line. Yeah. But it seems like that requires the sort of ability to inject capital relatively rapidly. And we're at this, and so it seems like the opportunity that you seem to be sort of saying is, or there seems to be coming up in this conversation anyway, is that, you know, the public sector won't fund the sort of end user stuff, but if it did, or if the public or cooperative sector was willing to, like, you know, put some just a relatively small amount of capital into that kind of end user stuff and encourage that and provide the ability to scale it up rapidly, it could be tremendously powerful in sort of embedding those values in the world, basically, because this, you know, this is how, like, all these algorithms sort of dictate how politics works, how commerce works, everything else at this point.
Absolutely.
Like, yeah.
But, you know, it's interesting because technology development and technology platforms has sort of two parts of it. There's the underlying tech work, which is programming, and which we have probably the most amazing and fabulous example of a outside of capitalism cooperative ecosystem of intellectual property. Like, millions of programmers contribute every day to a commons that we use to build everything that we run society on. And the vast majority of all technology that gets used is held in commons under free software and open licenses. And so, like, in some ways, this is totally shocking, because this is not at all what capitalism said would happen. Nor is it what like someone like Marx said would happen, because it's not the state. It's people doing super valuable economic work because of social inclusion and feeling good, like all these non-economic reasons. And then they use that work to build all these businesses and do work on it. Now, the problem is that the work that gets done for programmers by programmers that's created this platform that we use for everything, everywhere. Their methods of working and their ideas for working and their way of collaborating is orthogonal to the way in which consumer software is created. So you have designers who need to express a strong opinion, and they need to do work that doesn't work in that just 1,000 cooks in the kitchen and everybody doing weird contributions and people going off and doing their own thing. And so what we don't have is that we don't have any funding structure for that, because the programmers could go work at some company and they're like, yeah, I know that like half the time you're working on some open source project, but your knowledge of that means that our business works, and so we're perfectly happy to pay for it. Now, on the other side, the designers, they don't get that benefit, and they don't have that way of doing it. And we have no model for cooperative product design that works very well. We have no model for how to fund it. And then even if we did get it working, scaling it is expensive. It's because you need a way of funding customer support people, and because marketing matters, and because you need documentation, and there's a bunch of things that people won't do out of the joy of doing. Like, people don't do that kind of work out of the joy of doing it in the same way that they do building this sort of underlying cooperative technology infrastructure, which is everything you see on GitHub, everything you see on GitLab, but the entirety of the internet.
It was interesting watching Drupal, the Drupal platform, try to bring in user experience consultants, because they brought in these people who did this really extensive process to like actually make it user friendly, like for end users. And they they went through this whole process. They really like tried to bring the whole community along. They had all these videos where they're like, okay, here's how we're breaking it down. What's your feedback on this? And then like they made all these recommendations, and I think they accepted like, maybe 75% of them, but the result was like clearly suboptimal, like because you need, like you were saying, like basically you need that 100% in order. You need a designer like someone like Jonathan Ive or whatever, like to have that 100% sort of dictatorial control basically over that process to really carry through that vision and to sweat every detail and make sure it all fits together. But that's and so are you saying that there's, we don't have a way of doing that? Is there a way of doing that? To me, it's like if there was enough.
There's the design justice movement. There's the Sasha Constanza Chalk's design justice book, and trying to do that kind of stuff. I think that most of the people involved with that, they tend to do graphic design instead of like technology design. I don't know if there's a great fit for all of this. And I don't know that we have a good working model of it. I think it's a mistake to say that we need a Johnny Ive dictatorial method. It's more like art. Like when you make art, you want the vision of an artist. And that means that they're not necessarily a dictator over the people who are helping the artist make art. So if you're a sculptor, you're not doing it all on your own. You have people that help you, but you're able to push a vision. And what we don't have is this. So Planetary works on this protocol. It's called Scuttlebutt. One of the other applications is this really nice open source application called Miniverse that's made by a Brazilian hacker who lives in Finland. And it's much more, there's no business behind it, fully open source. And they got funding from I think it was indirectly from Google, but to hire some user experience researchers, and the user experience researchers studied the application and came up with this beautiful report. Exactly the same thing that happened at Drupal, but just on a much smaller scale. And two things were interesting. One, half of the recommendations for Miniverse were things that we did in Planetary, where we had a closed product design team drive the user experience. So like we came up with the same stuff. And then the other half of the recommendations were things that we wished we had done in Planetary because we could see them in the roadmap. So but the problem is Miniverse has no salaried people who could be told, okay, implement this the way this user experience designer tells you to implement it. And if you don't have that, then there's nothing to make you do it, and it doesn't get done. And it certainly doesn't get done. There's an incoherence in cooperatively designed software that doesn't exist if you let a person or a team drive it.
Right. That also seems like a cultural issue, maybe to some extent, in the sense that you just need developers to know when to like respect the views of the designers and really hew to it, as opposed to not. But or maybe you're going in a different direction with that.
Yes, but these are voluntary associations, so you can tell people, hey, Rabble, go implement this, login system that looks like this, but I only implement the stuff I want, or I implement the stuff that I'm going to use in my day job, but I don't there's no one to go, there's no one to go, you can't make anyone do anything. And so unless you have people who are like, I really want to just spend the time on the polish of this stuff. Like Facebook has an entire team, a big team, just for the text area of posting new comments. Like there's a whole team for that. Apple has an entire team for the first page at apple.com. They spend months on that page every time they're going to iterate it. And those designers and those people working on it would find something more entertaining to work on and wouldn't put that level of polish into it. And
so that points back to capital.
Yeah, it's capital, because then we basically, there's some kinds of technology and some kind of development that we need to build in a way that like people need to be paid, and you can't just use voluntary labor.
And it seems like the problem is that, all the code is this commons, which, as you said, is sort of this incredible feat, which is, under celebrated and maybe not super well understood. And so I almost see it like as a commons in the same way like a lake is a commons. Like you have this thing that generates all this biological activity, generates all this economic activity, and yet it's managed as it's nobody owns it, right? But then around it, you have all these for-profit things, like, whether it's fisher people or tour guides or water purification plants or whatever it is, and they're all making money in various ways, but they benefit from the perpetuation of that commons as a commons, not as subordinate to any one of those profit-making ventures.
And if someone were to start dumping pesticides in the lake, in a digital sense, you would copy the lake and move off and move your lake where you wouldn't get the pesticides. So like all of the organizations that use the commons engage in the regulation and protection of the commons.
Right.
And,
yeah. And forking is obviously a really powerful
yeah.
sort of veto that you have as a collective. Yeah.
And that's part of why it works, is because that forking power of saying, okay, you know, we're going to go do the work of standing up a new social organization if you start doing things we don't like with the existing underlying tools.
Right. So where was I going to go with that? I mean, I feel like, so there's the commons, but we have, but I feel like that's the underlying sort of substrate, but then everything gets built on top of that, because as we sort of just said, it requires this like
is owned,
yeah, and sort of commodified and turned into these sort of like algorithms that are, you know, deeply antisocial and sort of anti-communal in a lot of ways, because they're controlled by these platforms that are trying to monetize it. And so, yeah, I guess it just sort of highlights for me like how crucial it is for the public sector, for the cooperative sector, to sort of start putting resources into that sort of user-facing layer.
Yeah, and so we need to put resources in the user-facing layer. We need to put resources into sort of what is the structure of a user-sustained consumer application, and how do we make these? And another thing that we could consider is often there are failing businesses that have good technology and would be sustainable, but for the structure of the business. And the best example of them is what became Mozilla and Firefox. Like, it was a failing web browser, and it had lost to Microsoft. And therefore, the business of this web browser had lost its value to capital, but still had its value to people. And so there was enough money put into it, and then that group of people released a browser that people like to use, and then they sold that attention to Google and Microsoft to several $100 million a year to fund this organization. It's not technically a co-op, but it definitely is an alternative to capitalism, because it's not owned in the same way. And what we don't have is a good model for repeating that. We need not just one Mozilla, we need a million Mozillas. And like with Argentina taking failing businesses and injecting capital into them to make them co-ops, a lot of those co-ops weren't very viable and they needed to change, and a bunch of them failed. But they were taking a business that was going to go bankrupt anyway. What we don't have is any fund like that for interesting software that lost its viable business. This stuff gets, you know, sometimes open sourced, sometimes set out there, but like there's no process to do that. And if we did have an organization that did that, I think we would have a whole bunch of interesting cooperative technology businesses.
And yeah, so that sort of brings us back to what we were talking about before we started the recording, which is, you know, how difficult it is to find that money or just those resources to do things that aren't like generating a lot of potential profit. And so how do you can you say a little more about how you approach that in that world?
I mean, I don't know that I'm not successful at it, but I've founded a whole bunch of companies. I've funded them with grants. I've funded them with for-profit investing, and I've funded them through professional services. So we did software development and design for other people, and then we used that to build their products. And none of those solutions are any good. Doing work and then just taking the profits out of your own work to try and build things, you never prioritize building your own thing because you're always prioritizing the cash flow of the professional services. Grants are small, they're super inflexible, and they're slow. But the big problem is that they're super inflexible. Like, they're like, tell me exactly what you're going to build and how you're going to build it. And then you get rewarded from the funder, even, you know, the Shuttleworth Foundation and, you know, Eric Schmidt's personal fund, like even where the funders are really savvy about technology stuff, they just don't, it just doesn't work. And so you get slow, clunky, and the people who get funded are the people who are really good at jumping through the hoops of creating these reports and not actually good at building anything. Now, the venture capital community, they're perfectly happy to put money into all sorts of crazy ideas, but they said that basically the rule of venture capital is you can experiment in one way. So if you experiment in organizational structure, then you can experiment in nothing else, and you should do a business that you can already find product market fit on. And they're honestly super conservative. And that they want you to do the exact same model, and they want everybody to do that because they operate as a cabal where they co-invest in everything. And so uniformity is valued. And the primary thing they value is getting capital back out. And you see that in equity venture capital, and you also see that in crypto investors. The crypto investors just want capital out faster and don't like regulations or following the rules or anything that would prevent a classic capitalist bubble.
That's a fascinating rundown for sure, and lots of interesting, like obviously decades of lessons embedded in that like minute. So that's great. But I just want to go back to the self, I guess the service work, you know, or yeah, doing sort of fee for service and then using that to fund projects. I mean, so you started, as I understand it, a worker co-op in Montevideo. Can you talk a little more about how that went?
Yeah, so I did two different ones. One that never really got enough. Put together a team, we started stuff, we wanted to do work, never really got off the ground. And then I started a second company in Montevideo with some of the same people, where it wasn't a cooperative at all. It was just my company and people worked for me. We ran it cooperatively internally, and then we sold that company to Digital Garage, a Japanese multinational. And then at the end of 2 or 3 years, they decided that they didn't actually want that professional services office and the dev office in Uruguay. And so they essentially handed the business back to me as the original owner. And then I went to everybody who worked there and said, let's convert it into a co-op. And it survived as a co-op for another 5 or 6 years until the workers in the co-op. So as a co-op model, it didn't have the drive to expand the way it did pre-co-op. So slower to hire, slower to integrate. If someone went off to do something else, slower or not being replacing them. And then eventually what happened was they had a co-working space and a bunch of clients, and slowly over time, each of the co-op members decided to go off and work on their own projects or work directly for different companies, and saw sort of diminishing values of the collective, and the attempts at building products that weren't just professional services didn't work because of the distraction. Now there's a whole movement of bootstrap startups that believe in essentially, they don't believe in the cooperative ownership part of it, but they essentially believe in the rest of the economic part of it, and they're quite successful. I think the best, I think the best model of that is Calendly, which is a Black founded and run service for scheduling events. Like if we wanted to look at the cooperative movement and we wanted to look at where we do it, like looking at the Zebra startup movement and looking at the bootstrap movement, I think are the two places to look for businesses that are effective at building good product businesses in the technology space, but aren't driven by either state grants or the nonprofit industrial complex or venture capital.
So sorry. So in conclusion, you think that's still one of the better models?
I actually don't think there's a good model. I think I don't know. I don't have one I like. I've tried them all. They all
Right.
suck. I think the model itself is not direct. Like, the model can mess up the business, but the business usually fails regardless of the model.
And is that just a numbers game, or is that something inherent to the like menu of models that are available? I mean, you were saying that, like, it's, there's 1,000 failures for every, everyone that strikes it big. But
yeah, I mean, I think mapping it is just hard. And I think we have survivor's bias. So you see the ones that were successful, and then you're like, oh, whoever's the CEO who was around at the beginning, that must have been the founder. And they must be brilliant because of it. A good example is Tobias Lütke, Canadian or German, moved to Canada, started Shopify. He was a open source contributor in the Ruby on Rails, and a bunch of us knew him and we hung out, and he was really he didn't mean to start Shopify. He just wanted to spend his winters snowboarding and thought the idea of designing his own snowboards were cool, and didn't like the web software that other people were using for their shops. So he built his own, and then summer came and there was no work. You couldn't go snowboarding and no one was buying snowboards. So he's like, well, maybe I'll just take my shopping cart software and make it software as a service and let other people make their own little stores. And yes, he had to learn how to build this business. And now it's I don't know, a $50 billion business. And it's one of the biggest tech companies in Canada and all this other shit. But he's just one of many smart people who got lucky and kind of made some good decisions and worked really hard. And but the structure of Shopify was not defined by him or his values. That it was where do you get the capital to keep growing this? And the person who doesn't choose the capital that grows them faster loses to the person who does choose the capital that lets them grow faster. But I mean, if you think about it, GitHub, for example, sold for $8 billion to Microsoft. They were an entirely sustainable business without taking any investment. I mean, I think one time, 6 years in, they took money from some venture capitalists to pay out early employees and everything else, but there was no need for financing. They sold to Microsoft because the co-founders and the management team were tired of running GitHub. If there had been an easy path towards rewarding them from similar amounts of value to sell to the users of GitHub, they would have perfectly happily done that too, as long as the users could provide someone who would sort of shepherd the company forward. And so we have crowdfunding stuff for early stage, and we have crowdfunding stuff, but what we don't have is anything equivalent to ESOPs for technology companies.
Right. So I mean, to me, this seems to be coming back, and tell me what you think, but to just the need for a bigger ecosystem and more and varied approaches in terms of the nonprofit funding models, especially. But yeah, what's the path forward from your perspective? Because
When in nonprofit funding and technology, my answer is almost always don't do it, because nonprofit funders don't understand technology, and it's easy to spend tons of money and hard to get good results. And software development with polish is slow and hard. So, but I don't know. The most interesting network of folks that I've come across doing this is, in a cooperative way, the Inspiral Network out of New Zealand, where more than a decade ago now, a bunch of programmers got together and said, we don't want to just freelance, and we want to have community, and we want to build things, and we want to make the world a better place. And in order to make the world a better place, we need to more than just do activism, but we need to make sure that we have ways of supporting ourselves economically, and we can't ignore the economic factors of it. And so the names of what businesses within Inspiral are called have changed over time, but some of them are co-ops, and some of them are, you know, lifestyle pods or communities. And so Inspiral has been really good at creating lots of these businesses and creating a community that creates lots of these businesses. And some of them grew and then collapsed, and some of them have been sustainable, and but where they haven't been successful is the legal connection and ownership is informal. So if you're an active member of Inspiral, you're supposed to hand over a certain percentage of your income to the common fund that does stuff. And if you're a freelancer that uses one of their legal structures as a consulting thing, then they provide, you know, some healthcare benefits and pension and things like that. So people use them, and it's easy to take that cut. But for the other businesses, once they grow, they don't use the legal structures for their own payroll, which means they sort of slowly give less and less back. And so it's actually inverse from what you want. You want to assure that once a company that comes out of this community is successful, there's ownership and money flowing back into creating new ones, rather than, you know, oh, now we're this independent thing, you know, and we don't need to, you know, it's expensive to send money back. If they were co-owners and there was more of a formal leadership, like formal structure around ownership, then they would have a bigger fund. Now that doesn't mean that they haven't created dozens of co-ops for hundreds of people.
Right. So, so what I guess what I'm getting from everything you're saying is that we're still sort of throwing stuff at the wall, but we have some parameters to think through.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'll see what I can do in the next 20 years about getting governments to put a few million into a different social media platform, because that seems kind of necessary.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, it's interesting. Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future actually involves the government creating its own social media platform as a way of climate change. Like, it's like, but what they also create a cryptocurrency in there too. But what, yeah, just like, I think it's possible to redirect government funds to this stuff. I think, you know, I think a lot of that stuff is kind of industry capture of just like people who are connected and they take control of it, which means different people can take control of it. It's like party politics in the United States. If Bernie had tried to build, he tried to build a third party. Like, he wasn't a registered Democrat for most of his political career, and eventually came to the conclusion that at least in the structure of the United States, in the structure of how US things work, you're much better off taking over the party from inside than outside. And so that just depends on the structural rules. In other countries where you have proportional representation, say in Uruguay or New Zealand, if you want to have influence as a different ideology, it's perfectly effective to go create their own party. because you can actually get elected. Now, in our case, we're struck with an economic system that is capitalist, and so we have to figure out how to work within that. And one idea that's being thrown around for some folks, and actually I've talked to venture capitalists about doing this, is like, instead of making it a co-op, you make a for-profit company and then you set aside a certain percentage of shares as a class that's owned by a cooperative. And so if you are a worker co-op, you are a worker of the main company and a co-op member in this associated co-op that owns a portion of the primary company. And that way, to the outside, the primary company looks like a normal investor-backed company. And I think there's something there in that model, because the investors need to know that they get the return on a rocket ship. Like if it goes to the moon, then they do well, and aren't bothered by a single investor that happens to be a co-op. But they would not be involved if it was a cap on returns.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. But isn't, yeah, I mean, I guess you'd want, I guess that is the way to attract that capital, but wouldn't it be even more ideal to just like not have to have a cap on returns, but still have the investment?
Sure. I mean, if you can control a government that issues the currency and therefore you benefit by the currency and the general economy growing, then you don't need to return on the investment directly, because the productivity in the economy grows and therefore you have resources to invest in new companies.
But just talking about a company like Planetary, like it's just seems like you'd need like a city like Barcelona to like have a sub project of a sub project, fund what you're doing in a sustained way for it to like have a order of magnitude of difference.
Sure. And you look at Tor and Signal, and both of those were funded by mostly Radio Free Asia.
So the CIA.
Yeah, the State Department that's aligned with them, but like they took a teeny portion of a small part of some weird propaganda budget and said, wouldn't it be cool if we built something that evaded censorship in Iran and China and Cuba? And the activists are like, sure, you can use it to evade censorship in China. We're concerned about you guys, but you can do that too. And like, that's where the like $1 million or $2 million a year that was required for a decade for those technologies to get mature.
Right.
That's where it came from. And the US, in this case, it was Slack because they have tons of money, but also they benefit from a global adoption of technologies that reinforce the American system. And like Tor and Signal don't undermine the American system, they reinforce it. And reinforce a set of values that the US government advocates for. I mean, yes, they want to be totalitarian and stuff, but like,
I guess I keep coming back to that because it feels like it's the most promising, because it's so, I mean, clearly those are models that work to some extent, but just like, what if it was, I don't know, a municipality, that left-wing municipality or something, instead of the State Department,
Yeah. Except that, at least in the case of Madrid and Barcelona, we did take over the governments, and we did put progressives who understand these cooperative principles in charge of the technology budgets, and we don't have anything that really came out of it. But that does, maybe we need to do it in 1,000 cities instead of 2.
Yeah, I mean, clearly there's a process of iteration there. Right? I guess that's a whole other show to get into the details of what happened there. But I think I'll leave it at that. But do you have anything you want to add to that whole conversation?
No, It's wondering. It's interesting. I don't think
Great.
I have profound wrap-up words.
Fair enough. Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of open questions, so we'll leave it at that, I guess. All right, Evan. Thanks so much for coming on.